Let's bring in Glenn Greenwald, investigative journalist with First Look Media. He was the first to use information given to him by Snowden to break stories of NSA surveillance. And this spring, Glenn has a book coming out called No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA and the U.S. Surveillance State. Glenn, thanks for being here. Let's get right to it. The president announcing 5 reforms. Perhaps the most notable one has to do with bulk phone record collection, so-called Section 215. This collection of metadata is going to continue. It's just that a third party may now be in charge of the database. Here's why President Obama argues this collection needs to continue to be stored.
The program grew out of a desire to address a gap identified after 9/11. One of the 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mindar, made a phone call from San Diego to a known al-Qaeda safe house in Yemen. NSA saw that call, but it could not see that the call was coming from an individual already in the United States.
So the president argues, Glenn, that this data is used to map the communications of terrorists so law enforcement can see who they may be in contact with and see it as quickly as possible. If it's stored somewhere else, does it make sense?
Problems with that statement that he just made, which is that they're completely contradicted by everyone who has looked at that question, beginning with his own White House panel as well as a federal court judge that both said that there is zero evidence, that this metadata program is actually effective in stopping any terrorist plots, as well as leading experts in al-Qaeda such as Lawrence Wright and Peter Bergen, both of whom have said that the idea that this program would have helped stop 9/11 is ludicrous since the government had all of the data that it would have needed to stop the program and just didn't even know what it had because it had too much, which means collecting more actually makes it harder to stop terrorism problems. I think the real question is, should the government in any form, no matter who's holding it, be forcing the retention of all of our phone data even though we're law-abiding innocent citizens? It's really the question of who holds it, I think, is a trivial one. The bigger question is, why should the government be keeping all of this data on us at all?
Well, I guess the counter-argument would be if they had been able to map that call to that known al-Qaeda operative and see that that individual who placed the call was actually physically in the United States, maybe something would have been different.
But Jake, nobody in the debate at all is opposed to targeted surveillance, meaning taking the people for whom there's evidence to believe they're engaged in terrorist organizations or involved in terrorist plots and placing them under very careful surveillance. The question really is, what kind of values do we have as a country? We could eliminate all sorts of crimes, Jake, like rape and murder and kidnapping and pedophilia, if we just do away with the requirement that police officers first get a search warrant before entering our house, or if we let the government put video cameras in all of our homes and offices and watch what we're doing all the time. We make the choice that we'd rather not do that because we'd rather live with a greater risk of crime than let the government invade our privacy. The fact that there's a 0.5% chance that it could have helped a terrorist plot 11 years ago in terms of detection is hardly a reason to do this massive, ubiquitous surveillance program.
Glenn, the president also noted that it's possible Americans may regret weakening the NSA's power if something terrible happens, as seems inevitable. Take a listen.
The men and women at the NSA know that if another 9/11 or massive cyber attack occurs, they will be asked by Congress and the media why they failed to connect the dots.
That's true, isn't it?
This is just fear-mongering. If you go back and listen to the statements of Bush officials whom President Obama used to routinely mock when they defended all of their war on terror programs, they would say the same thing. Our responsibility is to keep everyone safe. If we don't do this, we're going to be criticized. If you're a leader, you don't govern in fear. Oh my God, I need to do this because if I don't, people might criticize me in the future. No, I don't think Americans, after the debate that we've had, are ever going to turn to the United States government and say, why didn't you increase the powers of the NSA or keep it the same? Americans, polls show, clearly want serious reform, and that's what I think democratic leaders in a democracy ought to be responding to.
Glenn, lastly, I don't know if you've heard from Ed Snowden since the president's speech, but if you have, tell us about it, and if not, I know you do communicate with him on occasion. Has he gotten any measure of satisfaction from the fact that the president is being forced to address this, make some changes?
I mean, I'll let him speak for himself through his representatives, but what I will say is I do speak with him regularly, and he's been incredibly gratified by the debate, not only in the United States, but around the world, that has been obviously triggered exclusively by the courageous whistleblowing that he's done, by the seriousness with which governments and populations around the world have taken this debate, and the very bipartisan movement in the US government. There aren't very many bipartisan movements these days, but there is a serious bipartisan coalition in the US Congress to impose real limits on what the government can do to our privacy. And he's extremely gratified and I think proud by the role that he played in triggering that debate.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much for your time.